anyways, I would like to tell us that Chanukah and Purim, both of them, are called weekday Yom Tovim. Now, what does that mean, a weekday Yom Tov? It has halachic significance, and that is that they're not Asr and Malacha like like Yontif. They're, so to speak, they're work days. You can actually do all kinds of things. That it doesn't have the restrictions, if you want to use it, of a Yontif. It also doesn't have the positive commandments of Yontif to the same degree. But what is particular about Chanukah, even more than Purim, they're regular days. They're not, they're Yomim of Halal V'Haidah. And I would just say, in most of Klal Yisrael, you probably wouldn't know that it's Chanukah if you're not around Chanukah lighting time, right? It's a regular day. It's a regular day that we do on this regular day, the mitzvah of Hadlakas there is Chanukah, and that makes it into a Yontif. So that needs some kind of an understanding. If the nace of Chanukah was so great that it deserves to be a Yontif, why don't we see more Yontif to the Yontif of Chanukah? There's nothing going on. It's just, a few latkes here and there, and that's the end of it. And the answer to the question is because it's supposed to be a weekday Yontif. That's the purpose of it. And this is, I'll just, for the Mekubalim discuss it. These two Yom, there are three main Yom Tovim, and there are two support Yom Tov, which is Purim and Chanukah, and they are like the feet that hold up the torso, and they are supposed to be weekday Yom Tovim. That's first. It's very important to understand that, and I would like to explain something about weekdays. I'm going to start with a story that happened to me when I was a bocher in yeshiva, and I had this discussion with my mashgiach, and there was a certain time that I wasn't following the Sidrei Yeshiva exactly. I had my own, much longer than the Sidrei Yeshiva, but I wasn't on the program exactly punching the clock like everybody else. So my mashgiach pulled me aside, and he said, you have to get back onto the Sidrei Yeshiva. So I said, why? So he said, because Seder is very important. So I said, I think that being productive is important. Why is Seder so important? So he gave me a whole speech on the subject, and he told me a story about himself. And this story, I think, is a story which I've taken with me for my life. It's a very important story to me, and I'd like to share it with you. He said, when I was a bocher in yeshiva, I had a chavrusa, and we used to learn till very late at night. We used to learn till like 3 o'clock in the morning. And afterwards, I would put my head on a stender and go to sleep until Shachris. My chavrusa would walk a block and a half back to the dormitory and go to sleep on his bed. After this was going on for a piece of time, I asked my chavrusa, I said, you're such a Baal Taiva for sleep that you have to go back to sleep in your bed? Why don't you just sleep on a stender like I do? And my chavrusa said, because I'm afraid. So I asked him, what are you afraid of? He said, I'm afraid one day I'm going to get old and I'm going to be wanting to learn by my stender and I'm going to fall asleep. But if I never sleep on a stender, that's not going to happen to me when I'm old. And then my mashgiach smiled at me and he says, you see, I'm already older and at night I fall asleep on my stender. My chavrusa, he doesn't. His chavrusa was still alive at that time. He said he doesn't fall asleep on his stender because he had a schedule and he kept his schedule. That's a very important idea. And the schedule that people have is extremely important in Avodas Hashem. Now, I'd like to share with you, I'm going to use a mashal that I heard from our yeshiva once about what's called a masmid. He said, you have a person who's a stockbroker, works in the stock market, and the stocks, all of the stocks are collapsing one after the other. The market closes at 4 o'clock. it's 3:15 and he sees today is a bad day, does he just go home or does he stay around to the close because maybe he'll be able to get some kind of a deal? What does a good stockbroker do? He stays there to the bitter end because, as they say in New York, it ain't over till it's over, right? For those who know what that means, that's a fine idea, okay? So a person who has a Seder sticks around and sticks to the Seder no matter what. What does that mean? I'm going to tell you, the Mashgiach told me in the same conversation another story. He said, you have a Seder, and you're true to your Seder, and you keep to your Seder, and once in a while something comes up that you have to borrow and pay back. You have your Seder, and you have something that you have to do. Your friend is getting married, so you're going to the Chasana, so you're going to make up the time of your Seder. That's fine. What's going to happen? One day you're going to get married, and again, you're going to have something that comes up, and you're going to borrow and pay back that time. Everything is fine. Then your wife is going to tell you, I need you to do this for me. It's very, very important. And you say, yeah, but I have a Seder. So she'll say to you, but when it's important to you, you're able to borrow and pay back the time. So this is important to me, so borrow and pay back the time. Now, I'm just telling this to you as the man, but the same thing would be true if it was the other way around. When it's on your own volition, your own steam, and you really believe in the thing that you're taking the time off, you will pay back. But when it's because your wife is twisting your hand behind your back and you're forced to do it, you're not going to have that stick-to-itness to necessarily pay back in full as you would. And at the end of the day, who's losing out? You're losing out. Why? Because you don't have a Seder. Okay? Now, all this is to get to the following point. And this is something which I believe all of us suffer from this. Sometimes we're davening, and it's just not going the way you would like it to go. So you say, okay, let's just get through with it. And you just finish off the davening quick, even quicker than usual. Why? Because it's not working anyways. That is not called sticking to it. Sticking to it means it normally takes you 8 minutes to daven your Shemona Esrei. You stand there for 8 minutes just staring at the walls. Why? Because your davening time should not be shortened because you're not having kavanah. So you'll stand in front of Hashem for 8 minutes twiddling your thumbs. Hopefully he won't be doing that, but I'm just saying the point is that if you have that commitment and you keep that commitment even hollowly, in other words, you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing in that time, but you're not doing something else that keeps you that you're checked into where you're supposed to be. And that is something which is very, very important. That is a weekday kind of an avodah. You take the mundane and you take the bad times and you make the commitment in the bad times. And this is something which is unbelievably excruciatingly difficult. You can just imagining all the good things you have to do, all the mitzvahs you could be doing, and here you are standing doing nothing because you committed yourself to something. It almost doesn't make any sense. But it's practice. You have this time, a sacred time that you're davening. It doesn't have to be about davening. This can be about whatever is your issue. And the fact that you are sticking to it drives home in your mind that this time is Kodesh. It's not something secular. It's not up for debate. It's not up to squander or to swap for anything else. And that makes that time a holy time. Now, I would just like to broaden this idea. I have a sister. One of my sisters is very religious. She's called a tzaddikus in the family, and she actually is a well-known tzaddikus. And she's like a spiritual kind of a person also. Now, in her house, she used to have a room that was called the Kodesh room. That room was where they ate on Shabbos, and you're only allowed to do mitzvahs in that room. That room was reserved for Kodesh, okay? And that went through many different stages, but that concept always remained in that room. I'm going to share with you 30 years later the following story that happened because of that room. My father, in his last year, he had to go to the hospital for some kind of a treatment, and he was supposed to stay there overnight. That's like usual for such a kind of a treatment. But he had to get back to Lakewood. It was like a Thursday, wanted to be back for Shabbos. So my sister talked the doctors into letting him go home, and he's going to be at home, and we'll take care of him at home, and he'll be just as good as home. Fine. So he comes to my sister's house. I heard this story from my niece. My niece is already married, a married lady with like 3 or 4 kids already, and she comes to her mother's house in the morning, and she sees my father davening Shachris in the kitchen. Okay? She doesn't say anything, whatever. And when she's about to leave, so she comes in, my father's already finished davening, and she says, good morning, whatever. So he said, I want to apologize and explain to you what you saw. I really was supposed to be in the hospital. Ein li koach. I don't know how you say that in English exactly, but ein li koach is, I don't know, it just doesn't go as well in English. But ein li koach, and when I woke up this morning, I realized if I'm going to get dressed, I'm not going to have koach to daven. So it's either daven in pajamas or get dressed and not daven. So I decided I'm going to daven in pajamas. So I went to the room where I usually daven, which is this holy room, and I realized this is where we eat our Shabbos Suda. This is where we do all the mitzvahs in this house. I'm not going to daven in my pajamas here. So he went to the kitchen to daven in the kitchen, because that's not a Kodesh room, okay? And my niece, she told me over this story. She was very moved by it. Here's a fellow who shouldn't be out of bed, let alone davening. And this is because you have a kviyas, something has a certain amount of kedusha to it, even though you're in a situation which allows for an exception. You're not going to make that exception because you want to keep it the way it is, so that it should be kept clearly in your mind like that. This is a very important idea, and this is a important stepping stones. This is how failures become stepping stones to greatness, right? That davening, standing there like an idiot, twiddling your thumbs, is what makes it that the next time you daven with kavanah. So that step down is actually a step up. That's the idea of you have your yontif in chol. It's about the lower class things, not the mitzvahs that you do. I did a mitzvah and you're on a high and you feel great about yourself. Whatever great mitzvah you did and you accomplished, so you really feel good about yourself. But sometimes there are mitzvahs that you do that are just, they don't elicit even any emotion from you yourself. You do them because you have to do them. You don't even think about it. But you don't give them up because that's part of your day. And this is a very important idea. There are people who have mitzvahs which are part of their day, and they become the rhythm of your life. Now, some people, they give tzedakah always before they daven. Now that is brought down in Shulchan Aruch. That person is supposed to do that. That's a halacha in Hilchos Tefillah. That's not a halacha in Hilchos tzedakah. That's a way that gets your tefillah to be more accepted. It doesn't get that any richer because you gave it before you daven. Okay, this is for your tefillah. It does something, and these are things which people call them almost pre-functionary actions. They don't have great thought goes into them, but they are the things that set you apart. Now, there are all kinds of things that are like this in life. I'll just tell you, somebody one time said to me about a Rebbe of mine, he said, You know what's so special about him? I never was in a minyan together with him and didn't hear him say Amen Yesh Merabah out loud that everybody could hear it. So, I stopped to think about it. I said, okay, that's a fascinating thing. All right. And then this Rebbe of mine told me one time something about my father. He says that he learned from my father in Tefillah a certain anhaga. And I realized that what he did was he took that anhaga which he saw by my father and he applied it to himself. And this is what it turned into, the way he used that connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And this is a very important thing. People have this, and I'm just going to share with you an idea, which is an amazing idea. My father, probably, I would say at the time, he was about 70 or 75. He wasn't a youngster. And he had a siddur that was falling apart. And he sewed it back together. You couldn't even bind it anymore. You had to sew the pages back together. And I asked him, what are you doing? Why don't you just buy a new siddur? So he looked at me, horrified, This is the siddur that I daven with, This is like a special siddur. This is the siddur that I daven with. I said, yeah, I also have a siddur that I daven with. But I'm not attached to the siddur that I daven with. And it probably has to do with the level of kavanah I have when I daven compared to the level of kavanah that my father has when he davens. And that siddur is something which has an importance for him in his tefillah. Now, I know women have their siddurim. I come to shul and I take a siddur off the rack, and that's the siddur I daven with. It's generic by which siddur it is, and I don't use the same siddur all the time. Whatever comes, that's what I daven with. I will say that when I daven b'yechidus, and I'm in a place, like I'm in an airport or someplace, and I'm davening without a siddur, when I close my eyes to daven, I daven from the siddur that I daven with when I was a little boy in school. Okay, that's the siddur that, if you ask me, what does my siddur look like? That's the siddur that I'm, in my heart, I carry with me. That's not the siddur that I daven from every day, but there are people that have a siddur that they daven from every day, and it's important. It's so important that I'll just share with you a halacha which I believe is true in Hilchos Shabbos. A person who davens from the siddur that they daven from all the time, and there's a page that's ripped. And if they're going to daven from it on Shabbos, they're afraid the pages are going to separate when they open it. And when they close it, it's going to go back together. Some places can say you shouldn't use such a siddur. According to what comes out to me, according to the Mishnah Berurah, if you daven from that siddur better, that's a good enough reason that you can use it. Okay? Even if there's some kind of a question in Hilchos Shabbos, because the siddur that you daven with, that's the siddur that you daven from your heart. It works better. Okay? That's like, these are things that a person does, that these are not special things. These are everyday things that a person does, and a person who does them well will reinforce doing them well, and they will have a greater meaning to him, and they will bear fruit. Now, this idea is the 24 days that lead up to Chanukah. The 24 corresponds to the amount of letters that there are in Baruch Shenkva Machus L'Olam Voed. This is not mine. This is written. And what I understand, the concept behind that is that when a person leads his life, like we're saying, with these small things, so then he becomes a walking Kiddush Hashem. It's a person who does the small things, big things. Everybody, I heard this from Rav Gifter once. He said that regular people are impressed by big things. Big people are impressed by small things. Okay, I heard this from Rav Gifter once myself, and it's a fascinating idea. It's the small things that make the difference. Rav Baron Kotler said that you become a gadol from learning the minutes, not the hours. Everybody learns the hours of Seder. It's the minutes that you chop around here or there. That's what makes a difference. And this is true also. The chesed which a person does, which is their chesed project, whatever that is, that's fine. But it's the extra thought when you think about it, when you chaparah something extra, that's really what makes a very great difference. I'll just share with you a story with my wife, which I believe is a very important idea. And this is like a very women's-y kind of a subject. My wife has a friend. I don't know, I told her over this story recently, and I said, I think you told me it was this, and I said, no, it wasn't that friend, it was a different friend. I have no idea who the friend is. But this friend of hers was going through some kind of a crisis, and she asked her Rav, and her Rav says, you don't have to daven until the crisis passes. So she didn't daven for that, whatever, half a year, whatever it was. After that half a year was over, so she started davening again, and she called my wife, and she said, it's not going. She's davening, but it's not going. She's like the person I'm talking about. She's standing there, but it's not happening. Her tefillah did not come back to her. So my wife said to her, okay, so the Rav says you don't have to daven. But before you do something, you don't say to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, help me that my cake should come out good. You don't. And the lady said, no. So my wife says, nobody said that you're putter from that, right? So I told my wife that this idea, which he's saying, is actually the Shloah Kodesh says it, that this is the idea before we do something, we say, Emirtz Hashem Be'ezus Hashem, and that brings Hashem into every action that we do. And the later Mekubalim say, the Gemara says, Halavai Sheispal Adam Kol Hayom Kuloi, means that everything before you do something during the day, you say, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, help me out, that this should come out okay. These are not formal tefillos, okay? These are a person's personal discussion to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for help. And they have a special place, Parshas Vayechi is where this is discussed, in the Targum, Bebuusu Itzlusi, and this is a special kind of a tefillah, a person's personal tefillahs that he has, that he makes to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and these are about the small steps in your personal life. What you do, how you relate to HaKadosh Baruch Hu is really very, very important. And in preparation for Chanukah, I believe that this is something which is very important. On Chanukah, there's not much for people to prepare, right? Like how many latkes can you make? How many sufganiyot? So what is it that you're supposed to be doing on Chanukah? In my opinion, what you're supposed to be doing on Chanukah is you're supposed to be doing all the things that you do all the time, just a little bit better. In other words, we're not asking you to, do something special. Just do what you're doing well. I'm talking about the mitzvahs that you do. Whatever they are, whether it's the davening, whether it's the chesed, whether it's even, a person, a lady has to clean up her house. That's also her avodas Hashem. That's a very important thing, that your house should be in order. That's a person's avodah that he's supposed to be doing. A person has to understand that is part of what they're supposed to be doing here in this world. A lady's going to come up to Shemayim after 120 years, and she's going to demand schar for keeping her house clean, because that was her job. Now, obviously, if the reason you keep your house clean is so that everybody in the block should say you have the cleanest house on the block, I didn't say you're going to be getting schar for that. But if you're doing it because you want to live in a house that is appropriate for the Shekhinah to be there, then yes, you will get schar for that. That is 100%. That's no different than the Kohanim sweeping up in the Beis HaMikdash. Okay? Now, it's a person's private Mishkan, and the Shekhinah comes there. It's the woman's job. That's where the responsibility of these things fall, is on the woman. And it's an aspect of making the place that you live in a place that's roy for Ashras HaShechina. So now, I didn't say that's a very glorious job, but, it does what it's supposed to do, and if you do it with the right intent, that's called a very important mitzvah. Now, I just want to just take that to another level. What does it mean that your house is a Beis HaMikdash, is a Mishkan? What does it mean? Okay? I was just going to answer the question very superficially without getting very deeply involved in it. The answer to the question is, whatever we do, we like to pride ourselves in thinking that it's part of our greater obligation to serve Hashem. And everything which we have in our house is there to help us do that. So if a person's house is a place that gives off that aura, then you were successful. Now I'm going to say over a story which is a fascinating, terrible story, and I believe that this is true probably for everybody here at a different level, myself included, but it's an important story to know. When Rav Avrohom Baruch Zachariash moved to Cleveland, and they made the Telze Yeshiva over there, one of the supporters of the yeshiva had a few major tzaras happen one after the other. And he came to Rav Avrohom Baruch Zachariash to speak about his problems, and he asked him a whole bunch of questions. And what came out of the conversation was that this man had a television and a Sefer Torah in the same room in his house. So Rav Avrohom Baruch Zachariash says that you can't have a television and a Sefer Torah in the same room in your house. So he met the fellow a month later and asked the fellow what happened. So he said, no problem, I got rid of the Sefer Torah. Okay, so now, I'm not telling you what to do, but I'm just saying that you want to know, and this is something which is very important. When it comes to you have to get rid of something, what goes first? I'll just tell you, I heard from my father many years ago, we say, Ani Rishon, Ani Achron. That's what we say in davening. So he said the proverbial translation is that when a person gets a cut in his paycheck, the first thing that he stops doing is giving tzedakah. And the last thing that he puts back in place is giving tzedakah. Ani Rishon, that the first cut goes to tzedakah, Vani Achron, the last. Now he says that is a person who doesn't have it right. A person has to understand what is it that you're supposed to be cutting first. And I'm not going to tell you what it is because I don't believe that there are two people here that it would be the same thing. But it's not supposed to be in your avodas Hashem. Whether it's a question of time, whether it's a question of money, a person has a certain level of ruchnis that they're living on, and when things get tough and you have to cut something, I'm talking about the regular weekday things. I'm in a big rush today and I have other things to do. So do I skip lunch or do I skip saying Tehillim? Let's use that for an example. So a person should understand that at least what you should want to do is to skip lunch and not skip Tehillim. Sometimes you have to eat lunch because otherwise you're going to fall apart. I'm not right now discussing what one should do, but the concept of our weekday lives are supposed to be for a purpose of making all of our lives more ruchnius. And if a person does that, the weekday becomes a time of halal v'hodah. The weekday things that a person who lives a life like that, and I know many people who live lives like that, they are always full of halal v'hodah. They can tell you about so many unbelievable things that happen to them and how they're grateful to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that's because HaKadosh Baruch Hu is very real in their regular mundane things that they do. And that's the avodah that we have. We have a week left until Chanukah comes, and the idea that we're supposed to be doing at this time is preparing that we should be able to fill the kelim when HaKadosh Baruch Hu pours the oil into us, which he's going to do in Mirz Hashem on Chanukah. We should have kelim that are ready to accept it. How does one? What is the major avodah of Chodesh Kislev? The Bnei Yissaschar says is the midah of anova. A person who considers himself not a fulfilled person, but a person who has much to grow on, even mundane things become spectacular to him when he can accomplish them. And my bracha that I'd like to give you all is in this week's time, you should be zoicha to take this week, and next week, which is already Chanukah at this time, you should all be able to accept the shefa that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to give us, because what Chanukah gives us is something greater than the Bria has in it. The Bria is only 7 days, and Chanukah is 8 days, and that means that you can be a super achiever on Chanukah. But the amount of super achiever that you can be on Chanukah is dependent on how much you prepared yourself in advance for that opportunity. She'al b'zaycha Mirz Hashem to have a yomim of halal v'aidah, and you should be able to have simcha in the regular days of all the year. Okay? Okay.